Chapter 7 Charo's Home Range. Once on top above the shell slide, and well out of danger of being trapped or cornered, the colts both took a long breath of relief at the narrow escape and scare they'd had. They soon got to feeling pretty brave again in being free and in the open, also as curious as ever, and now that they was on safe ground, Charo wanted to investigate the two lions that had been by the slide, for he sort of wondered why them two hadn't sprung at 'em from there. They'd had a good chance, all downhill and sliding, where the ones below didn't have any chance at all. Circling above and past the slide, Charo soon spotted the two lions, still in the same place, and now taking a good look around to make sure for a good quick getaway in case him and Colonel had to. Charo took the lead on down towards the lions. There seemed to be nothing ferocious about these, much as he come closer, ready to turn and go to running any second. These was much smaller than the other two, and only seemed to want to hide, but Charo wasn't going to be fooled as he came still closer, and finally getting still braver and too close for comfort, for the lions, they showed their teeth at him, but got up and moved away. At that Charo got the feeling that these was scared of him, that he had 'em buffaloed. Then to carry on a big bluff, he put his ears back, showed his own teeth, and rushed at 'em. To his surprise and pleasure the bluff worked. Colonel then joined in on the fun, and in mighty quick time had the two a-scampering and rushing for the slide, where they rolled over and over and slid on down to meet the two big ones below, their papa and mama. These two smaller ones was their youngsters, a whole family which the colts had bumped into. That turn of events seemed to please the colts very much, like giving the big ones a real and good horse laugh in return for the scare they'd been given. Now satisfied and leaving the big ones lashing their tails in disappointment, the colts went on to higher and more open grounds. They would go on following the high ridges from now on until they was at least well out of that lion family's range. But in that land they might get out of one such range only to get into another, and it would be well for them to keep on the alert always, keep away from overhanging ledges, watchful when going through patches of jack pine or juniper. Also keep out of other such boxed-in washes or canyons as they'd narrowly escaped out of, or any other place where a lion could hide and wait to spring from. Well-beaten trails to watering places are the most dangerous, and all such would be found out through instinct, to later be dodged more through experience, and there would come a time when any such dangerous places would seem as well noticed as if a big sign was posted there. Like with many other things the wild horses or game had to watch out for in that country, even to the human, which to them was the most dangerous of all. Quite a strip of such a country was covered during the few days that followed, and nothing scary happened along the way much, only that they come across a rattlesnake now and again, but that didn't bother them, for the reptiles most of the time gave some warning. That was well enough understood, and being they seemed anything but worth investigating, they was just given plenty of room. Lizards of all kinds wasn't even noticed. Coyotes was once in a while sighted and sometimes passed by to within a few yards, but they wasn't hardly paid any attention to either. Colonel thought they was only dogs, but if the colts would ever got bogged down or helpless in any way, them harmless-looking coyotes would turn to be as dangerous as any lion. There'd been more lions, too, a-watching the colts as they trailed along or grazed, but the colts didn't see any of them, for being they had now got some experience with them, and experience they profited by and wouldn't forget as long as they lived. They knew of the kind of country they'd hang out in, and circled well around all such. The lions seen them only at a safe distances and places. Deer, also wise to the lion, was often seen in such places too, and the colts, only through mild curiosity, would sometimes stop to graze amongst them, neither kind with any fear of one another. It was the same with the few antelope that was in the country. The antelope belonged to the flat and open ranges, but like the wild horse, and since the human hunted and crowded 'em out of their rightful land, they also had to make the best of the badlands, and took refuge there. The badlands would always be such a refuge, for no matter how crowded the country around got, the plow could never level or tame that barren land to farming. Even the hunters would seldom get in there, for it was a near impossible country to ride in a horseback, and being there was well-timbered mountains with good trout streams in other parts, the badland strip was left pretty well alone by them. A prospector would wander in once in a while, but it was soon found that the colors there was all color and not of gold. There was also the lion hunter who'd come to get at the big cats for the bounty that was hung up for their scalp, and them was the real friends to the game and horses there as well as in other ranges around. But he was dogged too, for, going by all other humans, he was only a killer and not to be trusted. The wild horse runner was another to be dodged. As much as the deer had to dodge the hunter, the wild horse runner would set traps of wire and cedar corrals in them badlands, and so well built and fitting to the country that a wild horse would often find himself closed into one without hardly knowing. These traps would be around water holes, and the gate would be sprung closed, while the horses would be inside of it drinking. All in all, the Badlands was well named when considering what all every living thing in it had to keep watching out for. Even the snake and lizard wasn't safe, and neither was the spider, centipede, and scorpion, which they lived on, for in turn the eagle, buzzard, and hawk would get them too. With their rambling in such country, the colts made out well enough, even if sometimes it was a long time between drinks. For a few days after the skirmish with the lions, Charo led on pretty well in one direction, and even though in having to wind around considerable, like covering 8 miles of twisting ridges to make one straight one, getting around unpassable deep cuts, towering cliffs and such, and in their traveling taking their time and seeming aimless was, after all, pretty straight towards one point, where the sun would be setting of evenings, and a good many miles was covered in that direction, maybe only 50 miles as the bird flies, but more like 150 as any hoofed animal would have to go to have followed their trail, and their winding trail would be hard to follow, for it being most always on high ridges, sometimes so narrow that only one could go along at a time, and where the wind blowed most always, a hoof print would soon be blurred away, or show no sign of the hard earth and rock. Only a couple of small bunches of wild horses was seen during the first few days of the colt's rambling, for they ranged in that dry and hot country mostly during winters only for need of shelter, and they could do a long time without water there when the snows come and banked up in the many crags. Charo didn't let up much on his lead through that country, and it was quite a few days from the time him and Colonel left the ranch when he at last didn't seem to want to go any further, only to graze and water in one scope of country at the edge of the Badlands. It was where his mother had ranged, and where he'd been foaled, his home range, and he'd come to it as natural as any grown horse would. It's been known of wild horses traveling 400 and 500 miles so as to get back to their home range, going through towns and settlements, crossing bridges and many such places where they couldn't be driven through by rider. Once again on his home range, Charo seemed satisfied not to go beyond it, and even though he'd been only about a month old when his mother and him and the bunch they was with had been chased from it by wild horse runners, was many miles away from there when he couldn't go no further, and was left behind. He still knew his home range, the water holes and the boundaries of it. His mother and the bunch had most likely been caught, and as for himself, having been left far away from his home range. Then, in looking for his mother and rambling on some more, like lost, suffering, and not realizing where he was going, when Brad found him, there was no telling how far he'd strayed. But with his return to life and strength while at the ranch, his wild instinct also returned, and as gentle and tame as he'd been there, it wasn't his true nature, and the call of his home range got stronger right along as he'd come back to life. Then the pasture and field gates had been found open. Charo didn't go to looking for his mother when he got back to his home range. Fact is, he wouldn't have known her if he'd seen her, for, like Colonel, he was well weaned so's to entirely forget all about her. Him by his suffering and then the long winter at the ranch, and Colonel by the long and strange distance and the change of climate. Where Charo still had some advantage over Colonel was that he still had a range that was natural home to him, where Colonel had none, but that didn't seem to matter much to the thoroughbred no more, for all was so strange and interesting, and even though he did think of the home pastures and missed the company of humans once in a while, he was now fast beginning to get weaned away from that too. His home would now be on Charo's home range, at the edge of the Badlands, where it was there was more shade, water, and grass. Also when in danger of Mustang runners, there was always the thick of the Badlands to hit for and make a getaway into. For that reason, there was more horses along there. Not a day or night passed but 2 or 3 bunches was seen, and at the sight of each bunch, Colonel was no more for running towards and meeting 'em. He'd learned one good lesson as to that one when the black stallion had near took him apart, and that was another experience he'd never forget for as long as he lived. He still very much felt the scar of that meeting. Charo, being already wise and mighty careful that way, wasn't for making acquaintance with any bunch right quick, nor even show himself to 'em. A right bunch would come along some time at the right time, and then would be time enough. He was plenty satisfied to be just with Colonel, and even though that long-legged pal of his needed plenty of watching and coaching, that only gave him a feeling of responsibility, which he had plenty of time for and enjoyed. like being big brother or leader, and Colonel more than looked up to him that way, even if Charo was near a foot shorter and some months younger. But as things went so well with the two runaways, the feeling sure didn't carry over the Badlands to the Hippo Ranch, where now Virginia was doing a heap of fretting, riding and squinting and trying to track 'em down. She of course knew right away on her return from her trip that they'd got out of the pasture and then the big field. She'd seen their tracks on the outside there, but being them tracks was about a week old by then, was so blown and tracked over, there was no following them to any distance, not even as far as the horse range. All she got out of the tracks was the general direction the colts had taken, but she couldn't very well go by that either, because what little she got by the tracks was so winding and aimless like that there was hardly no telling where they might have went after they got to the horse range, where the tracks had led to and vanished. Another thing was that what little she could get from the tracks as to where they'd be headed was another direction from where Brad had found little Charo, and where she figured was his home range and would go back to. She knew wild horses and their ways well, but she didn't know that the colt had been so far away from his home range at the time when he'd been found. She knew, too, that that little rascal, as she now and again called Charo, had been the leader in the getaway. That Colonel would never have gone on by himself, took the lead, or left the saddle horses, which hadn't tried to go. But knowing that didn't help her any. She at first rode the horse range well, thinking and hoping that they would be with or near some bunch there. She accounted for and looked through every bunch, even the stud bunches which she knew they wouldn't be with. But she let no chance pass by, and finally making sure they wasn't on the horse range, she went to skirting the Badlands, sometimes part ways into them, and wouldn't get back to the ranch until after dark, on a very tired horse. But on another and fresh horse, she'd be out again early the next morning, made big circles at different points from the ranch, inquire from neighbors, cowfolks, which was a day's ride away, and where she'd sometimes stay for the night. There wasn't a bunch of horses to within 40 miles. Every direction of the ranch that she didn't look through, and with the neighbors also being on the lookout, that made quite a stretch of country that would be covered, over 100 miles from the ranch in some parts. Of all the country being covered and riders being on the lookout, there was only one that Virginia didn't think of, and that was the very same one the colts now was in, beyond the Badland Strip. There was good and plain enough reasons why she never thought of that being the country they would be in. One was that she figured that was a way off from where she figured Charo's home range to be, from where Brad had found him, and that let her off, with another good reason that the colts would never try to cross them Badlands. Then, one day after she'd covered every part of the range she could think of where the colts might be in, she asked her dad if he would have Brad ride the country where he'd found Charo. She'd already rode close to it herself, but not as much as she wanted to, for it being mighty barren and a long ways, she couldn't make it and be back to the ranch for that night. Brad, having got back to the ranch for a short spell between rodeos, would be glad to go, for as her dad told her, he'd been near as worried about the colts, especially Colonel, as she was, and he was anxious to get 'em back. And I'll do better than that. Cal had went on to tell her I'll send Red with him, and a pack horse with grub and bedding, so they can make camp and ride from there for a few days, if necessary. "But I'll do that only on one condition, Virginia," he added on, "and that's that you stay home and rest up for a spell. You're about all in, and so are your horses." Virginia was sort of glad to agree to that, now that Brad and Red would be out to relieve her. She knew they could do much better and cover more territory than she had. As her dad had said, she was plenty tired, and now that the colts had been gone for so long, over a month, and she'd sort of lost hope of ever finding 'em, she was resigned some and could rest a little easier. 3 and then 4 days wore on, and no sight of the riders, but she didn't fret so much, for she felt that as long as they was out and looking for the colts, there'd still be hope. But them 2 riders would have to be back on the next day, whether they found the colts or not, for they'd have to be on their way again to take charge of the stock for another coming rodeo. Jim had been left to keep his eye on 'em in some pasture close by there. Brad and Red did show up on the next day, late, so late that the ranch house was all dark. They was glad because they was tired and would rather not tell of their failure in finding either track or hide of the colts until morning come, when they'd have to leave. If they could have had another day or so, they would have found 'em, because they'd been combing around and in the Badlands, and had been close to where they was ranging. Brad and Red hardly thought they'd be there, but as horse hunters know, strayed stock is sometimes found where least expected, and they'd went, but they'd took another day or two and added that much more time for their return, making them too late to handle the stock that had been contracted for the rodeo. They would have told Virginia of the only country they hadn't rode when they talked to her the next morning as they was fixing to leave, but that would be useless, they thought, and besides, they might get another chance to ride that country some other time. They knew it was all rough and wild horse country. It would take a lot of riding and time, and if the colts was there and had joined in with some wild bunch, as it was naturally figured they would, well, it would take plenty more riding and time. Virginia took the disappointment sort of calm, thanked Brad and Red for their efforts, bid 'em good luck as they got in the car and drove away, and then watching the car disappear into a cloud of dust, it seemed her last hopes sort of went with it. As they left, Virginia didn't have much heart in even thinking of how to go on, if at all, in hunting for the colts. It seemed altogether useless and hopeless now, especially after them 2 so experienced horse hunters had failed. Besides, she hadn't as yet received no word from the other neighboring riders, who had and would be on the lookout for them. Then there'd been the many long days she'd spent and long weary miles she'd covered without one sign of 'em to encourage her in the hunting. It all proved very hopeless, but in often thinking of 'em it was hard to give up and entirely lose hope of ever finding them. It was disappointing and aggravating enough, with losing track of just plain range stock, but with them 2 little colts which she'd become so attached to, well, it was much of another story. Worrying about 'em, as she sometimes did, she thought of many things that might have happened to 'em, like getting down in bad places where they couldn't get up or out of. Maybe lions might have got 'em, for there was some which sometimes came from the bad lands to the horse range. She'd made a close guess there. There was many other things she thought of which might have happened to the colts. One was so young and small, and the other so green and helpless. Likely happenings to them would crowd up in her mind until she could hardly stand it no more. Then she'd go to the corrals, saddle one of her now rested horses, and go for a ride with her dad, or at whatever stock work might need to be done. and then she'd get to thinking in more cheerful ways that nothing could have happened to them colts. They was too strong and active. Charo was too wise. Colonel was too fast. And with the middle of summer now on, with good grass and water everywhere, they would be just roaming around, enjoying their freedom, and some time, when she'd least expect, she'd ride onto 'em. Such thoughts was sort of cheering, and as she rode most every day, there wasn't only the work to keep her interested, but also the steady looking for the runaways, with some returning hope that she would find 'em, maybe any day. The summer wore on that way. Brad and Red didn't get to come to the ranch no more during that time, for rodeos on many different parts of the country came fast and steady and kept the boys on the jump. They wouldn't be able to return to the ranch until late fall, and then there'd be rush of the fall roundups and works to be finished. There'd be no time for Brad and Red to go hunting for the colts no more that year unless a couple of extra riders was hired to take their place, and such riders who knew the country so well would be hard to find. Virginia had of course notified the 2 line riders, which her dad kept, but their riding never took 'em anywheres near the Wild Horse Range where the colts was running. As for Cal himself, he seldom got very far away from the home ranch, for his interest and the handling of the outfit was from there. But that summer he did get away more than usual, not to go hunting for the colts, because secretly he didn't care if they was found or not. He'd been through with thoroughbreds, and it was only for Virginia's sake that he sort of wished they would be found. So, seeming as though that was hopeless, and wanting to get her mind off of 'em, he'd framed up some excuses to have her go with him to different places in the car, and sometimes to be gone for quite a few days at a time, at rodeos, which she always enjoyed, and also taking some of her friends along for more company. For Cal would almost always want to be amongst stock and the company of the men there. But even though she enjoyed herself during the trips, she showed no enthusiasm when her dad would tell her of going on one. She would be slow in getting ready, for leaving always reminded her of the time she did leave for such trips and return to find the colts gone. Then she'd be all the more anxious to get back in the saddle when returning, asking Anne and the boys at the lined camps if any word had been heard or any sign had been seen of 'em. She'd sometimes even hope and expect the colts to have been found during her absence and been put in the corral for pasture again. The car wouldn't seem to go fast enough on the way back, then only to be disappointed each time the ranch was reached, for the colts wouldn't be in the corrals nor pasture, and there'd only be head shakings as to their whereabouts when she'd inquire. Nobody had seen 'em. Chapter 8. The Return of the Prodigal. But the colts had come mighty close to being seen by humans a couple of times that summer, and for a very short time Charo had. Mustang runners had been swooping in on that range, and it had been through only Charo's watching, keeping in out-of-the-way places, and from joining any wild bunch that him and Colonel hadn't been rode onto, and maybe into traps with others. He'd often watched some long streaks of dust as bunches of wild ones would be heading up long ridges for the Badlands, sometimes only to run into the wings of blind traps while trying to make their getaway. At the first sight of such dusts, Charo was quick to lead the way to where him and Colonel could see but not be seen. Colonel hadn't been much for hiding that way, especially sometimes when up on some high point, and a good breeze would be fanning. He couldn't understand, but sensing Charo's warnings and knowing of his wisdom from past experiences, he would always follow. But there'd been one time when Colonel couldn't follow. He'd got sick, so sick and weak that he could hardly navigate. It had been from drinking from a pool where alkali from one spring and sulfur from another run together, mixed and stilled. Charo hadn't drank any of that water, but many wild horses had, and with no bad effects, for there being much of that kind of water in the western ranges, the wild horse, like the range-bred horse, was well used to it. But not so with Colonel, and this mixed pool he drank out of light to laid him flat to stay. For a week or so afterwards he was moping around, like hardly seeing, lost all of his slim roundness, and was in near as bad a shape as Charo had been when Brad found him after he'd lost his mother. Only Colonel wasn't suffering as Charo had, and he could realize a few things, but he couldn't follow Charo any distance, and he didn't care to eat. But before he'd got too weak, Charo had managed to lead him on to another and more out-of-the-way spring, too small for any bunch of horses to come to, and purer water, with only a little sulfur in this one. It had been there that Charo took his stand to watch over his sick and long-legged partner, and now that he was near a year old, he could do a mighty fair job of that. He'd been grazing at a little distance one day, while Colonel was at his sickest, when he seen a rider coming straight his way, so close that he'd had no chance to duck out of sight. He suspicioned that rider to be a mustanger, and so, thinking fast, his wild instinct led him to act according. He'd hit out as though a bunch of hornets had lit into him and kept a-going. That way up country, like towards the Badlands, until he come to a tall pinnacle, which he circled soon as he lost sight of the rider. Then on the other side of it, where he waited a spell to see if the rider would follow, and seeing no sign of him, started slowly back for a brushy hollow near the spring, where he'd left Colonel in hiding. Charo's jumping out of the way, he had did more than the lead the rider away from the spring, for, seeing the lone yearling hit out, that rider felt satisfied there'd been no more horses there. If there had, they'd also showed themselves, and run as the colt did. As it was, the rider had followed on, not trying to catch up with the colt, for one lone one is not bothered with by Mustang runners. Besides, a bunch is easier handling, and at that time he'd seen the dust of a good-sized bunch, one that some of his partners had spooked, started, in which he was to try to turn towards a trap, along with more that had come. But if it hadn't been for Charo's play, Colonel would have been found. He of course couldn't have been moved right then, but seeing at a glance that Colonel was no Mustang, and well worth many of 'em, he'd been kept track of until he was on his feet again, then brought into the Mustanger's camp, taken care of, and got in fair shape, when he'd been shipped along with Mustangs, and sold for what he'd be worth to a stranger, which would have put him in a worse fate than he'd ever been in, for no telling of who would have bought him, or what he'd been put to. Anyway, Charo hadn't wanted to lose his partner, and when he got back, seen the Mustanger off at a long distance and fast riding away, he drew a long breath of relief and went to the hollow where, stretched out to the sun, Colonel laid plumb unaware of Charo's run-in, leading the Mustanger off. If Brad, or even Virginia, had showed up at that time, or for that matter any time since Charo had got to his home range. They'd found him the same way the mustanger had, a very different acting colt from the one of only a month or so before, for as gentle as he'd been while at the ranch, every bit as tame as Colonel was. He'd now gone back to his natural wild state. What was inborn in him had sprouted to life with his returned strength, and now, back in his wild surroundings, he was the same as the mustangs or any other wild animals in that country, only wiser by his knowledge of the human's ways. It wasn't ingratitude nor forgetfulness that had changed Charo so. It was his natural and born free instinct, like that of the eagle or wolf, and even though maybe tame in captivity, there was no resisting any chance to freedom. He'd of a sudden tamed down again, and well remembered Virginia's good care if once caught. He'd et out of her hand and followed her around, the same as Colonel would then. But now being free was his life, and for as long as he could breathe it, was in his blood to keep that freedom. No good care or treatment could take the place of that. All animals have more or less that wild instinct. Even some humans show it pretty strong, and only are more greedy, cruel, and ruthless. There's none of such in the wild horse, and even though Charo was very different than Colonel, that was due to the many generations of his ancestors having been left to rustle for their own feed and shelter through the centuries. Before him, Charo's far-back ancestors had come from as fine blood as Colonel's was, but in making their own in a wide, wild, and mighty strange land, they had to adapt themselves to fit in. It took many generations, but by nature's hand and necessity, and as them first fine-bred horses accumulated, growed wild, and spread from Mexico north during the centuries, there wasn't much trace left of the built and looks of their great ancestors. They'd got smaller, narrower, but not in the brain, for they was very wise, weary and wily, much quicker and hardier, and even though they'd lost some of the speed, they made up for that in every endurance, to where their very own ancestors would be lost in trying to keep track of 'em. Charo was one of just such descendants, and with the generations through centuries of wild blood in his veins, he was now, in comparison to Colonel, the same as a wolf to a Great Dane. He'd showed his natural wild wisdom when he'd led Colonel to a good hiding place, then led the mustanger away from there afterwards. He'd also showed the spirit of his wild breed when his Colonel was at his sickest and hadn't been able to get up for a couple of days. He'd fought off the coyotes that circled around, and sensing Colonel's helplessness, would have soon attacked and put an end to him. Charo had stood guard night and day over him during that time, and even if lions had come, which they might have, he'd made a stand, and, young as he was, would have most likely went down in fighting for his friend. Colonel was sick for a couple of weeks, and got down to a shadow. Then, finally recovering, it took him still longer to recuperate enough so he could go on with Charo some more while grazing, sunning, and watering. And there, with watering, was where he'd learned one more lesson which he'd never forget. That was to know the watering places, and when afterwards Charo would pass on by a spring without touching the water, Colonel would be sure to do the same, no matter how thirsty he might have been. There'd be bleached bones around such springs, like signs of how poisonous they was, and Colonel had got to know them by that. If he'd drank out of one of them springs, instead of the sulfur and alkali pull as he had. His bones would have also now been bleaching with the others round there. With the lessons Colonel had now learned and pulled through by the help of coaching of Charo, there was many more which was due to come his way, but he'd got by with about the worst ones, only now he'd have to watch out so them same experiences wouldn't repeat in a different way, being on the alert always, sensing danger and signs of it, from a breeze, quiet noises, sudden flight of a bird, a rolling stone, or many such signs, which warns all of the wild wasn't as yet known or even noticed by Colonel, and he would never learn to notice or understand them much, not as long as he was with Charo, for depending as he'd got to on that little wild one's wisdom and alertness, he was like blind to anything but him and would near entirely depend, go or do by his signals, which he now understood well. To detect and learn all signs as Charo knew them he would have to be by himself, and that would take a long and dangerous time of hard learning, like with the sureness of his footing and the steadiness of his long legs in the rough and rocky country. He would never be able to master that, not in his generation, nor for a few after him, but this which he had gone through, and the more that was to come, would give him a mighty good start. His strength and roundness now sort of returned to him. Charo took the lead as usual, and now went on more and more on the outskirts of his range, for along about then the Mustang runners was getting numerous, and there was seldom a day passed when the dust of many bunches of wild horses, stirred by them, wasn't seen streaking through the country. Gradually, many bunches started to migrate out of that range, some to maybe return when the Mustangers would let up for a time. It was during such migrating that one day Charo finally decided to join one of the bunches. Him and Colonel had made acquaintance with a couple of bunches before, but for some being too ornery in one bunch, and the most being weedy, locoed in another, they hadn't gone with 'em very far, only to find 'em out. There was only 6 in the bunch Charo finally figured would be all right. 4 of 'em was young stallions, which had been whipped out of bunches by older ones, still too young to get and hold their own. A couple of years more, and they would start making it interesting for them, same or other stallions, and maybe whip 'em out of the same bunches they'd been whipped out of. The other 2 in the bunch was old reprobate saddle horses, one which had been caught from a wild bunch, well broke to ride, and then got away when his chance came, which was very natural. The other was a good range-bred horse, which had been too tough for one cowboy. Bucked him off, run on packing the saddle for a spell when, after ganting up some, it slipped under his belly, and he kicked it to pieces. Them 2 ex-saddle horses made fine wise leaders, and wasn't afraid of even the wicked fighting stallions of any bunches. All they'd keep shy of was the man on horseback. First, the lion, which they only gave room to. Second, and of course the rattler was respected too. Charo had spotted that little bunch from a high ridge, where him and Colonel had been breezing themselves, and he didn't have to move out of his tracks to see what they was, for as they trailed along slow, they came to skirting right alongside of the ridge he was on, and, without being seen, could make out that this wasn't a dangerous bunch. He started down to meet them, and Colonel, still leery from his first meeting with a bunch, watchfully followed, ready to backtrack to a flying run at the first threatening move from any of them. The first of getting acquainted didn't take long. There was just the ordinary squealing and pawing, but no fighting, and the bunch went on, Charo and Colonel left to follow or not, too, as they pleased. They followed, and as they went on with them for a couple of days and got more acquainted, seeing which one was first boss, second boss, and so on, Charo sort of figured they would be a good bunch to range with. No bullies or troublemakers, and with the wise old leaders, even Charo could still learn plenty more. There wasn't a dopey one in the bunch. With Charo finally deciding to join in with the bunch that way, it wasn't that he was any time lonesome with only Colonel, or that he wanted more company. It was that in numbers there'd be a steadier watch kept. Not all could be asleep at the same time, and of course the company would also be good, along with a feeling of more security. Colonel at least thought so, and after he got acquainted with all of 'em in turn, he grazed and traveled along by the side of any as well as he did with Charo. But not for very long at a time, and when anything happened to set the bunch to looking up and around, or spooked to a trot or a run, he was right away by Charo's side again. There was more running since joining the bunch than there'd been when the two was alone, and the reason was that with Charo he'd been more for watching from high points, and only to hiding where he could still watch when such a rider would be sighted, the only time he ever would hide. The bunch wasn't much for hiding, but more for hightailing it at the sight of a rider, or the faraway dust of a running bunch, winding along through rough and deep cuts and canyons, and sometimes at full speed on some high ridges or open lands, where they'd be in sight of the rider for a spell, and while hitting for some more rough country. Colonel more than enjoyed them running spurts, much more than Charo and the other wild ones did, for with him there was no fear of riders, nor worrying in getting away from them. He run more like for the fun of it, and of course to keep with his pal, Charo, and the bunch, and there was times when all was running at their best. They would still be too slow for him, and he'd come up to run with the leaders. Sometimes he'd run past and away ahead of them, but then he wouldn't follow his lead, which wouldn't be a wise one, and he would have to turn to get in with it again. But there come one time when, even though by accident his lead had turned out to be a wise one, but the bunch hadn't followed him, none but Charo, when a rider swooped down on the bunch and got it going where he wanted it to go, towards a blind trap. Seeing that the bunch wasn't following, Colonel was for turning to catch up with them, as he'd done before, not at all minding nor realizing what the sight of the fast-coming rider meant, but Charo, now being with him, once again took the lead, right on the way Colonel had started and away from the bunch. At that, Colonel hesitated and near stopped while halfway between Charo and the bunch, wondering which to go with, but there was no wondering for long, as he once again looked the direction of his little partner, making mighty good speed, and now all alone. The bunch wouldn't be much without him. With a shake of his head, and acting as wild as any of the wild ones he'd seen and been with, he then raised it high, snorted near, as good as a wild one would, throwed up his tail, sort of bounced along like an antelope for a ways, and then stretched out to his top speed, too soon catch up with Charo. Colonel had put on such a speed in catching up with Charo that the Mustang runner, even though mighty busy watching and riding hard after the remaining 6 of the bunch, couldn't help but notice the speed of the dark, long-legged yearling. He'd never seen any such before, not even amongst some mighty fast and grown wild ones, and that made him wonder not only at the speed of him, but for what he might be, for there was well-bred horses would sometimes get away and join the wild ones. Sometimes also the studs would steal mares from the gentler and better breed range stock bunches. The mustanger glanced at him in admiration a couple of times more, and if it hadn't been that the 6 horses he was chasing looked good to him, knowing even from the long distance that at least 4 of 'em was young studs, which are always the pick to Mustang runners, he'd have let the 6 go and went after the 2 bunch quitters, Colonel and Charo. He of course knew that, even with the fast horse he was riding, he wouldn't have no chance to catch up with or turn that dark streak of speed, but he somehow felt that dark colt with all his speed wouldn't be as hard to manage as the light-colored one he was with. He'd noticed that the dark one didn't act like the wild ones and was running only not to be left behind, that he didn't show no fear of him and wouldn't make a break as a regular wild one would when crowded. He didn't figure he'd leave the light-colored one, and that one could be hazed into a trap, the mustanger thought, for he didn't have the speed. But right then, and being the 6 horses ahead was running well, and in the direction he wanted 'em to, he'd stay with them, on to the wings of the trap, and where a couple of other mustangers would join him, and help run 'em on in. He would get after that fast one and his partner on the next day. But them 2 didn't seem to be nowheres in or around that country on the next day. The mustanger, as wise as he was to the wild one's ways, had got fooled, and by the also wise little Charo. Him and Colonel had left no tracks as to their going on, and that was simple enough, even though seldom done, but they hadn't gone on. Charo had stopped soon as the mustanger and the bunch had disappeared. Then, instead of going on and making a circle as most wild horses would have done, he'd turned and backtracked right from there, and his and Colonel's trail was soon mixed with others of that same day. There was no fresh trail of 2 colts to follow, and to make it still better for them and harder on the mustanger, they run onto 2 renegade saddle horses to mix their trail with and go on to the other ranges. Them 2 renegades, being wise to traps, and sort of sensing that, on account the rider hadn't tried to turn 'em during the run, all going too well for him, and when they quit the bunch, and he tried to turn 'em back, they knew then they was getting away. They went against and past him, leaving the 4 young studs, which he'd managed to keep going on, into the trap. Them 4 now made as wise a small bunch as there was in that wild horse country, all excepting one, and that one made up with speed for the wisdom he lacked. He sure didn't need to be waited for, and with them 3 wise ones to learn from, he might, in years, turn out to be a fair leader. If he ever got a bunch that would and could follow him, he'd soon lead 'em on to freedom or into a trap. But there was few mustangers where the 4 trailed on to, from the time they got together after the chase, and as luck or fate would have it, it was towards the country where Brad had found Charo a year or so before. Charo sort of remembered some of the country where he'd tried to follow his mother while her and the bunch were being chased. They didn't get as far as where he'd had to quit, but near there, and now as him, Colonel, and the two renegades went to ranging in that country, he felt that he was still on his home range, at least along the trail, and not so far from where he'd last seen his mother. The range the four had picked on was a little out of the wild horse country, where there was more good water, grass, and shelter. Lions was scarcer, and there was no blind traps, for few mustangers ever came there on account it was more of a cow country, and where there, of course, was more riders. It was a country sort of between wild horse and cow country, where the cattle also got pretty wild, and sometimes the riders would have to pack a rifle along with their rope to get 'em down out of the rough mountain ranges. Being there was so few and scattering little bunches of wild horses in that country, the riders that came there seldom was out to get them. These riders would be after cattle, and being that mustang running and cattle gathering don't mix. Also, that if mustangs was wanted, they'd go where they was more plentiful. The wild ones in that country was left pretty well alone, but they had to be very wise ones, wiser than the average wild one, or they'd get caught there too. The two renegades in Charo was plenty wise that way, wise enough to know the difference between a rider that's after cattle and the one that's out especially to get the mustang. To Colonel, every rider was the same, just a man on a horse and nothing to be afraid of, but he did like to run along with the three wise ones. The only time that bothered him was when his three partners would spook at the sight of some rider, and regardless of where they was, would light out, sometimes more like falling than running off the steep and rough mountainsides, over down timber and through thick brush, as though it was all smooth bridle paths. At the sight of a rider is when they would take to such country, the rougher the better, and there was where Colonel would often hesitate and sometimes to be left away behind, when he would then take big chances and some falls, for his legs and breeding wasn't for such lands, and even though he somehow managed, he was often much worried until open and more level stretches was reached. Being an intelligent colt, he realized the handicap of his long legs and slim ankles, and that saved him many a fall, maybe a broken neck or leg, for he'd learned not to go headlong into dangerous places, more and more with getting snagged now and again, skinned up with scraping along sharp ledge rock, dead limbs as stiff and dangerous as bayonets, even to vines that would tangle him up and sometimes throw him. But the worst for him was to climb up the places his partners would, so steep and high that it would even bother a mountain goat. Coming to such places, Colonel would get to do a lot of watching, and some tall figuring to get around, and being there'd seldom be any other way, he'd have to tackle it or stay behind, for none of the three but maybe Charo would wait for him. But such runs and rough goings on being not too frequent, Colonel had a chance to sort of recuperate in between each, and getting wiser and surer of footing right along. For being young, he had a good chance to grow into that, and as it was, after that summer and from the start with Charo, he would now be too much for a grown one of his own breed to follow, unless that one was raised in that country as Colonel was being. Late fall come with Colonel still going strong, and even though scared and scratched up, Some there was a twinkle in his eyes that hadn't been there some months before. The blank greenhorn look was gone, and now when he looked at a thing it was direct and with more understanding. Even his appearance had changed some, and there wasn't so much of that helpless rookie look about him. And he could now, more than ever, pass any animal on that range when on a level stretch. The 4 was well up in the mountains when the first big snow of the year come. It fell to more than 4 feet at the timber line, and then's when Colonel got to see some of the animals he'd been on the same range with. There was elk, mountain sheep, and deer begin to come down from the high country and deep snows and heading for the hills. The horses was already there, ahead of the storm, and would be hitting on for still lower country, as more storms would come, but no lower than would be possible. The storms came near like on the hills of one another, and so that the horses not only had to get down off the mountains, but from the foothills, and at the edge of the big flats. Colonel again felt more at ease along the rolling lands, but there was no advantage to that much now, for the snow being so deep even there he couldn't very well run. Lunging and slow walking was about all he could do, and after now having to paw deep for his grass or brush, he didn't feel any like running. That energy went to pawing for more feed, which was scarce there and couldn't near get enough of. What was more, there was very little shelter in the bleak and open country, and the snow was too deep to get where there was some. The feed was also being beyond pawing for there. The first big snow came in late that year, much later than it had the fall before, but when it did come it didn't let up and go to chinooking as it had then. It stayed and piled on steady, and when it finally let up some to fine particles, cold winds came to drift it into deep banks, bared the land a little where there was no feed to cover up the most of what there was. It was the start of a hard winter with no let-up, when much stock and game would be snowbound, and many would starve. Riders would be at their busiest in all kinds of such weather, breaking trails and freeing snowbound stock. They would have no time to run mustangs, even if they was right in their way. And the wise renegades with Charo and Colonel knew it. They got so they would roam and feed where they felt like, and didn't run much any more at the sight of a rider in the distance. In roaming the barren country that way, now steady in search of feed, the 4 had got into the valley where now, over a year before the hippo wagon had made camp, and Charo had rode in it to the ranch from there. And now, even though from another angle, Colonel realized he wasn't so far from the ranch, and there was no badlands between, for them had been gone around. And now, with Old Man Winter steady, holding his grip, the brown colt, getting lean and gant, often looked the direction of the ranch and tried to lead the bunch on to that direction. Charo would sometimes look up that way too, and would follow along while pawing for the scarce feed, but never for very far from the 2 renegades, which wasn't for leaving the mountains too far behind and crossing the big valley, not towards no ranch, no matter how hard the winter, nor how scarce the feed. If Charo would have only followed, Colonel would have been quick to have now taken the lead and on back to the ranch, even to leaving the 2 older horses, but there was no leading Charo from them nor that direction, for even though he'd still rather have the company of his pal Colonel, and would have went on with him, he wouldn't go the direction of the ranch. than any wild horse would. A deer or an elk might, for the hay they would maybe get, but not a wild horse, and Charo had gone back to that stage. The deep snow, scarce feed, and cold didn't tell on him or the other two as it did on Colonel. With them they only lost some of their summer belly and roundness, but was strong as before, and wasn't as yet ganted up nor lean as Colonel was. Besides, their hides was thicker, the veins not so close to the surface, and their hair was thicker and longer, waving like tall grass to the wind, where with Colonel his hair wasn't much longer than it had been the summer before, and looked like he'd shed off in comparison with the others' long, shaggy coats. The severe cold was as much the cause of his shrinking and ganting up as the scarcity of feed, and it was no wonder he looked sort of longingly the direction of the ranch. There'd be warmth there, good clover, and blue stem hay, and even warm water to drink. As the severe cold and wind kept up, it was also a wonder why he didn't go back there, even if alone, but a horse being more attached to one another than any other animal, he hadn't wanted to leave Charo, not even for the comforts he knew awaited him at the ranch. Then Old Man Winter took a hand, blasted him with hard stinging snow, and cold winds that chilled him to the bone, and as Old Man Winter would have it, the first and sudden cold blast of that storm hit him, and he was quite a distance from Charo, which he'd been sort of trying to coax to follow, and with the suddenness of the blinding snow that come, he couldn't make it back to him. He tried, but he was near like a tumbleweed against the wind, and he was forced to put his rump to it and only stand. Charo, being in some shelter with the others, nickered for him, but the whistling wind killed the sound, and not realizing but what Colonel was also in shelter somewhere close, he didn't budge, for he knew there was no use looking for him in that storm. Colonel, now all alone in a bleak opening, and where the storm had a clean sweep at him, stood with rump to the storm, head down and moving one leg, and then another up and down in the whirling snow to sort of keep circulation. But that didn't help, and he was fast getting numb, so that he could hardly move his legs any more, and he hardly cared, for soon the cold feeling and suffering began to leave him, and now he was beginning to feel warm, comfortable, and sleepy. That was the first stage of freezing, and but for being now sort of hardened to the steady cold, he would have froze where he stood. He would have anyway, but like without realizing, he began to move a little, to move with the wind, and that seeming to relieve him some from standing against it, he moved on some more, very slow at first, but steadier as he went on, to finally drifting along with the storm, and losing all sense that he was drifting on alone. The storm kept him a-drifting on through the whole long night that way, and being he was now in the big open valley, where there was no breaks nor timber for shelter, he was sort of swept along through drifts, and there was no stopping to paw for feed in the blinding white-sheeted land, no stopping until the storm did, or he couldn't go no more. It was along near the middle of the next day when the storm and wind finally sort of let up. So did Colonel, and when he could now see a little, he found he hadn't been the only one to drift, for not so far ahead was a dark line of what looked like stock, and sort of encouraged at the sight, he moved on some more toward that line. It was cattle that had drifted on until they couldn't drift further, for they'd come to a fence, where with humped backs they lined up to wait for the end of the storm, and there amongst 'em is where Brad and another rider, while checking up on the cattle, found Colonel that day, also all humped up, but showed a very good spark of life as the sound of the surprised cowboy's voice came to his ears. The prodigal had returned.